Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. This video is the next in my series on rereading the classic Hardy Boys canon of 58 books, but also doing back-to-back comparison reads with the original texts of the first 38 volumes, which were rewritten to varying degrees or completely rewritten over roughly about a 20-year period starting in 1959. And the rewrites were done out of order and by completely different authors, and they varied to all kinds of different degrees. So again, some books merely had a few things updated and were tweaked slightly. Some were mostly rewritten. Some had entire subplots added or removed, and some were completely changed, and the only thing left of the original was the title, or the most basic part of the plot premise, and the fact that you still had Frank and Joe Hardy as the teenage amateur detectives. This is one of the most notorious examples of going in and editing works in all of literature, and the Stratemeyer Syndicate did this with both the Hardy Boys series and Nancy Drew around the same time. The idea was that they were updating to the then modern times of the 1950s and getting rid of some dated aspects of the books, particularly some of the cultural stereotyping that does pop up in the original volumes, which go all the way back to the late 1920s, which is understandable. They would have dated aspects. However, in doing these comparison rereads and actually looking at the material for yourself, it's also, I think, a matter of trying to get the page count down and trying to more unify the volumes with the books they were publishing at the time in the late 50s into the 1960s, and all the page counts of the original books were significantly cut from usually around 200 pages, if not a bit more, down to the typical 160 to 170 pages. And of course, they switched over to no longer making hardcovers with dust jackets, so that further meant that streamlining the books was something they were going for. So that's the sort of introduction for any of those who come to this video and haven't seen my previous reread videos, where I've discussed the first 9 books so far, and I go into much more detail, so I do refer you back to those if you've never come across this notion before. Volume 10 is What Happened at Midnight, which was originally published in 1931 and was written by series creator Leslie McFarlane. The revision text was done in 1967 and was written by Tom Mulvey, who wrote a number of the revised texts. Now, this is one of the volumes that the revision text, or the revised text, it maintains the original plot, but does add a number of other elements around it. It basically adds an entire subplot that's then infused into the main plot, and that is going to be the primary source of the differences. The other changes made are, as typical with the earlier books written by McFarlane, a lot of the character detail, the more lived-in atmosphere, and the great sense of humor and the sort of inherent rebelliousness of the boys, and any sense at all of authority figures being perhaps ridiculous or not to be listened to. All that stuff is stamped out, and the revised text always have a more, again, streamlined is the best way to describe it, but their focus is much more on increasing the pace of the action, and being written in 1967, in the midst of the spy craze, that obviously fits that they would want to redesign the book to be more action-oriented. Now, the main plot, in terms of who the boys go up against, it remains the same in both texts. They are dealing with a gang of jewel smugglers led by the notorious Taffy Mar. That's a wonderful villain name. And this eventually leads them to essentially an adventure in New York City. And you can just imagine 2 young boys going to New York for the first time, trailing a suspect, and the hijinks they get up to in the big city for the first time. And of course, they run out of money. In fact, they get pickpocketed and have to survive on their wits and, basically be roaming around New York broke, and they've really lost their suspect they were tailing. That is, I think, what most people remember from this book, but that's really more the main focus of the second act. The first act actually revolves around the Hardys inadvertently getting mixed up with jewel smugglers, and basically it is deemed that perhaps they know more than they should, and so during a party at Chet Morton's house at midnight, Joe Hardy himself is kidnapped, and the first act revolves around Frank Hardy and the rest of the chums and pretty much everyone else in their orbit trying to find where Joe is, if he's even alive. So there is quite a nice setting of the stakes in this book, and this is maintained in the revised text. So basically, the first act is Joe getting kidnapped and potentially being bumped off and having to figure out why he was kidnapped, because at this point no one knows why he would have been kidnapped. And the second act, it's the boys going to New York, trailing after a suspect, and then basically finding themselves stranded there. And then the third act is back in Bayport, dealing with the remnants of the Jewel Gang and trying to get to the leader, Taffy Marr, in an action climax. So the beats are the same. What happens in the revised text, not only is it a shorter page count, but we have the addition of the subplot of an inventor with a secret special radio device that the gang also seems to want, because in the revised text they're also electronic smugglers. And I think the most notable aspect of the revised text is its opening, which is entirely new, which literally has Fenton Hardy, the world-famous detective, order his sons to go to the inventor's house and break in to find the radio in a secret safe compartment and steal it essentially before the thieves or the smugglers will go after it and find it and steal it themselves. So it's an interesting conceit to open a Hardy Boys book with them actually being on essentially a sanctioned burglary attempt. And in doing so, there's a nice action sequence because they're able to get there just before the smugglers do. And then this subplot of the radio, they have to keep hiding away and keep it hidden from the smugglers, is carried out through the rest of the book. And it doesn't really add anything to the plot. It's just the subplot that is customized and inserted for the revised text to add some sort of new element, because for most of the revised text, they would try to find something like this if they kept the original story, because for some reason or another, it was, I guess, deemed a lot of the original text plots were not enough to fill out a book, or they had to have something new. So this is merely the subplot that's added. Throughout the rest of the book, we do have some additional action sequences and some other notable moments that are really fun, such as one of the boys disguising themselves to go interrogate and try and get information out of a prisoner in jail by pretending to be another gang member. And again, the action stakes are increased throughout. If you read these texts back to back, you will notice very quickly that in the revised text, in spite of the additional action beats and things, most of the text is pretty much almost verbatim in a lot of places from the original text. This did happen in a number of the volumes, even some of the ones I've read so far in this comparison reread. And even the passages where the text is shortened or changed, or the action is sped up and they have the subplot of the radio invention inserted, I mean, even simplified, it's still the same text. So when you're reading this, outside of the slight restructuring to some of the sequences, the new action beats and things, it's the same story. You know, it really is. It follows the same beats. It even has the same climax, even though in the revised text it's staged a bit different and they wind up going to a different location. So the core of the book is the same, and frequently even the text is almost verbatim, but you can also tell the difference that I talk about in all of these, especially when you're looking at the Leslie McFarlane written text. The revised text just doesn't have the spirit of the original. It doesn't feel as lived in. It doesn't have the same, that same sort of rebellious streak. It doesn't feel as, honestly, doesn't feel as gritty. It's a lot harder for the boys to accomplish things in the original text. And interestingly, when they run out of money, when their money gets stolen and they're flat broke and lost in New York City, in the revised text they just wire home for money, and they think about that in the original text, and they nearly do that, but they actually struggle for a bit and decide to try and make it on their own because they don't want to admit what's happened, and they actually manage to show their tenacity in a way, and it's really an interesting little conceit in the original text. So basically, it's a lot harder for them to get through the actual story in the original text. It's more two-fisted. That's the best way to put it. And that's pretty much what you get in all the original text, but particularly the Leslie McFarlane stories. And of course, it's hard to compete with the creator of these characters and the writer of most of the original books. But you also get the sense of there's a certain richness in these original texts. There's also a great deal of humor. There are frequent laugh out loud moments, just like all the other previous original texts. And while there is humor and levity in the revised text because it is mostly the same text, because it's been streamlined, it doesn't read the same. So even laugh out loud moments that are repeated in the revised text, it doesn't play the same. Like when the boys are almost literally run over by a tugboat in a fog bank when they're out in the Sleuth, which is the Hardy's motorboat, and it literally is a giant tugboat that comes out of nowhere and almost completely runs them down and kills all of them because there is actual danger in these books. That moment happens in both texts. Well, when Chet Morton recovers, there's this wonderful beat in the original text where he literally just goes around to the other boys in the motorboat and just shakes their hands, and they're like, "What's that for?" And he's like, "Well, for surviving." It's just this random beat that I love. But in the revised text, it's just simply described in like a sentence. It's not that moment doesn't play. It doesn't come across the same way. So even when you have exact moments duplicated, and the text is very similar because the revised text has been streamlined, it just doesn't. It doesn't feel alive like it does in the original text, and the biggest loss is usually the humor. It feels flatter in the revised text because the pace is much more increased and the text itself is streamlined. So I still really adore the additional action beats and the specific unique material in the revised text. I'll always remember the opening with the burglary and the stuff with dressing up as a potential gang member and some of the extra action beats added to the New York sequence. But outside of those, it's still the same text, and since most of it is almost verbatim, it's not as good as the original text. So this is an example where you can read both and you can recognize the slight tweaks and changes and also identify the unique material in the revised text, but it just does not read and play the same as the original text. So this is, I think, definitely an example where the original text is the better edition of the book. And of course, it was the original edition, and the revised text is merely streamlining it and adding a few additional beats and tweaking things a little bit. Now, my one sort of nitpick with the story overall, and this is slightly addressed in the revised text. In the process of the boys trailing the jewelry smuggling gang and going to New York and getting back to Bayport, they wind up actually running into two federal agents who are, of course, trying to crack this smuggling ring and trying to nail Taffy Mar and run him to ground. And they wind up basically working with the Hardys on and off, and they pass information back and forth, and the Hardys clue them in, and they eventually are on the scene at the climax in Bayport. Well, in the original text, it's very coincidental how they meet. It's at the end of the New York sequence when the boys are trying to get back to Bayport and they're flat broke. So it's a bit too coincidental for them to just run into each other. In the revised text, the boys wind up talking to the police force and actually going to the local precinct office, and it's the police who actually put them in touch with the federal agents who are trying to nail the Taffy Mar smuggling gang. So at least that makes a little bit more sense. But you also have to deal in the revised text how the Hardys seem to constantly be in contact and treated like full adults by all official law enforcement organizations and all adults and things. And that's when you get into the parts of the revised text that are probably a bit less than realistic, and you lose the shades of gray and the more realistic approach of the original text, where the Hardys are always having to prove themselves to adults and deal with police forces and officials who don't take them seriously because they're teenagers. And that's why it felt a little odd for them to just be sort of working hand in hand with these federal agents that they just happened to bump into in trying to stop this jewelry smuggling ring. Also in the revised text, there is actual participation from Fenton Hardy. He's off on a case that, of course, winds up being tangentially linked to the case that the boys are working on, and this is what the author ties in to the subplot of the inventor of the radio. Also, he happens to be apparently an antique plane enthusiast, which is how they build in a connection to the airport sequence from the original book. And probably definitely the action highlight of the original text is also kept here, and this is a great example for people who just think these are children's books and they don't have any real stakes to them. Well, the boys wind up tailing the suspect they're after at the airport, and the only plane available is an antique biplane that they go up in, which of course they go up in cloud cover and it develops engine problems, and the boys have to bail out and parachute out of essentially a stalling old biplane that is not the safest plane in the world. That is actually replicated in the revised text, and that's really the only reason why we have the whole bit about the inventor in the subplot being an antique plane enthusiast. It's in order to be able to keep that sequence. So there's a few little tweaks in the dialogue here and there to tie things in more to this subplot, and a few little added beats. Another interesting quirk I noticed is that we, of course, have the boys' legendary peppery Aunt Gertrude, who is a force of nature and always has an opinion about everything. But in the original text, she is an unstoppable hurricane force when she shows up, and is, obviously not the easiest person to deal with, but is frequently hysterical when you read these original texts and you read the sections when Aunt Gertrude shows up. It's like you can't imagine living with somebody like that, but it's also hysterical to read because she just goes at 90 miles a minute and has an opinion about everything. That is significantly toned down in the revised text, but a quirk I noticed was in the original text, Aunt Gertrude comes to town when Joe's been kidnapped and, of course, has opinions, but winds up relating something that she experienced at the train station that furthers the plot along. Well, in the revised text, she's already there in the Hardy household because in the revised text, she's pretty much a permanent resident for the most part. But then later on, it says that she simply arrives. And it doesn't exactly make sense why, other than perhaps the fact that somebody wasn't paying attention in the revision process, because I thumbed back through the pages and I was like, well, is this just a holdover from the original text where she came for a visit 20 or 30 pages in? So I thought that was an interesting quirk. I could be wrong, but I don't think there was any mention of her going away and coming back in the revised text. And in both books, we have the repeated motif of events actually happening at midnight. And the title refers to... Well, it could be several things, because in both texts we have the opening sequence taking place at midnight, and then the characters thinking about all the different experiences they had just a few days before at midnight. So the title runs through the book, and it's the theme of midnight throughout. Primarily, it seems like the title refers to Joe's kidnapping at midnight, which really sets the plot into motion. However, if you look at the revised text, and particularly with the Rudy Nappy final cover artwork, it seems to refer to the final act climax taking place at midnight when the boys are stalked through the city park. So you can sort of pick which midnight occurrence the title refers to, but I think it's best to just think about all the events happening because there are multiple events in each book that take place at midnight. So ultimately, as I've said, I think it's a good comparison read to make because this will show you all the little tweaks and changes and extra bits of action that the revision process would do when they added a subplot, but kept the actual original story intact. So this is, I think, a perfect example of the somewhat altered a Hardy Boys revision, because the alterations vary. You basically have slightly changed, somewhat altered, heavily altered, and then, of course, completely rewritten. And that is the greatest example of these rewrites. But this one, because it keeps so much of the original text verbatim almost at places, it really also underlines this sort of streamlining process of how much of the sense of character and time and detail is actually lost, even though you're keeping some of the same exact words and it's the same events. But of course, we're talking about it being transposed from 1931 to 1967 and having a significantly shorter page count. So all of the world building that's in the Leslie McFarlane books is unfortunately lost or diluted to a point that you're only going to notice it if you're doing these comparison rereads, and that will really underline the just how much of it has been diluted or reduced from the original 1931 text. And I still love the revised text because I grew up with this, and I especially love all of the additional action beats, but it makes sense now why those stuck out, because that was the new stuff they added, and the rest of the book is still it's still the 1931 text. It's just been transposed and streamlined and shortened, and the pacing has been sped up at the cost of all the world building and character detail. So I do think the original text is the better book, but I really love all the little additions of the subplots and action set pieces of the revised text. So I would obviously definitely keep both because I love both, but the original text is the better written book. Now to talk about the cover art designs, as I like to do in these videos, there are only 3 for What Happened at Midnight. The first is the original W.S. Rogers cover, which is the same design with the red lettering text of the title as all of the previous 9 first edition books, and in terms of having the hardcovers with dust jackets, and these were also replicated on the Applewood Books replica printings. Now this is really where the original style stops. It's really just these first 10 books that have the particular art design and the same title font lettering. They did retain some of these elements for the next couple books, but this is really where this original type of design ends. So once again, we have a very much period depiction of a particular event from the book. And this is literally where the boys are recovering Joe from where they found him kidnapped, right as they're about to be jumped on by the returning gang members, who actually start opening fire with their handguns and rolling boulders down after them. So again, the original text does have a much more vivid sense of danger, even though this same scene is in the revised text. It's not as gripping because the text is not as it doesn't get across that quite the same danger level as the original text. So the art is deceptive, as with all of the Rogers covers, where this is an actual very dramatic scene from the book, but if you just looked at this on the surface, you wouldn't think very much of it. But it is a really wonderful depiction of the period, because you have the boys in essentially, ties and dress shirts and pullover sweaters and flat brim caps and trousers and boots and things. So it very much looks like what you would picture 1931. And Joe is obviously weakened in the condition they find him in. But if you were to just glance at this cover, you wouldn't think very much of it. You'd be like, oh, it's some boys walking around the cliffside shore. But again, they're being shot at this point. Then there was an updated front piece art by W.S. Rogers, which made it into some of the later editions. That typically happened once they transitioned into different editions. After a couple years, they would lose the very lovely artwork that was usually done on a fancy piece of glossy photo paper or something like that, and then they just switched to an inked, redone front piece of artwork. Then in 1946, we got the second cover, which is, I think, absolutely wonderful. It's depicting essentially just before Joe is getting kidnapped at the midnight outdoor party they're at. This one was, of course, on hardcover and dust jacket editions, and later lasted into the picture cover era. I think this one is really wonderfully atmospheric, and depending on the printing you have, it can really jump out of the dust jacket or the actual board if you've got the picture cover edition. I've seen this in different printings look different ways. So, of course, as with all of these, the cover art will vary in color and color depth depending on how good the printing was. But I just love the design of this. I love the usage of shadows. I love that it's actually at midnight and we have the moon actually on the book cover. And because of the way it's placed, it almost looks like a price sticker when you first see this, if you've got a copy and you look at it. But if you look more closely, we have the moon, we have the moonlight, we have the house in the background with the lights and activity. And I love the usage of trees and the fence coming in at the bottom and the boys sort of half in and out of shadow. I think it's a perfect cover and beautifully done. The only problem is we don't really know who did this. The guess by most of the Hardy Boys websites and fan groups and things is that the artist was Paul Leon or Lon, or I'm not sure how you pronounce that, unfortunately. But it's just really a guess. There are, unfortunately, some covers where we don't know for sure who did the artwork. And then we switch over to the 1967 cover, which is, of course, by the iconic Rudy Nappy. And since it's 67, it has a little bit of the vibe of some of his other paintings around this time period of the late 60s to early 70s, where it's a really dramatized scene from the book, one of the central scenes. This is really, I think, what most people think of when they think of the revised text is towards the climax when the boys journey across the city park in Bayport at midnight, and they're essentially letting themselves be bait for members of the gang to come out and attack them. And one of them is Anchor Pete, who is a sailor who likes to use an anchor to kill people with. And of course, that's why he's on the cover. But it has a very there's a sort of psychedelic tinge, there's a sort of dreamlike quality to it, and I've always loved this cover. So this is definitely the image I think of when I think of this book, but this is a scene specific to the revised text. So I do think the second cover is the best for the original text, and the art for the revised text is obviously the best for that because that's all it's had. But I love both. I think each is a phenomenal example of the cover artwork for the specific times in which they were made, and I just love the sort of eerie, dreamlike, slight psychedelic quality to Nappy's artwork for the revised text. So you can't really go wrong with either one. I love them both, but the Nappy artwork is the one I'm most used to because I was always rereading the revised text, and this is one of my favorite covers of his. Also, just the staging of the boys with the tree in the middle, which is also sort of in an angle, getting the clock tower in the background, and the lighting of the sort of lamps throughout the park, and it's heavy rain, and you see Anchor Pete coming up out of the darkness and the fog. It's just incredibly atmospheric and just, I think, an incredible piece of art, really. I think both of both the second and third covers are great pieces of art in their own right, and honestly, so is the original cover. But of course, it's much more simplistic, and I think the second and third artworks are going to give you a better sense of the mystery elements and also kind of what the story is about without knowing the plot, whereas the first cover, it doesn't really suggest very much if you don't know the plot. It just looks like some boys standing around and maybe one of them tripped and so they're carrying him. But I do think both the second and third covers for What Happened at Midnight are sensational. So I just have two editions. My original text edition is a beautiful picture cover copy where the cover is in really nice shape. This is one of those that if you have this artwork on the picture cover, it's frequently got damaged or faded, and because the cover is so dark, it's much more obvious than a lighter colored cover. This has really nice printing on it, and of course it did originally come in the hardcover with this artwork as the dust jacket. This is a pretty late printing for this story because it lists to the haunted fort on the back, which would date this to about 1965. And of course, the revision was done in 1967. So this is one of the sort of last print runs of the original text, because they would just obviously have switched over to the revised text about 2 years after this. Being dated around this time, we have the brown and white end papers, which of course have the artwork and images from the older cover art designs, mostly the original text. And then we also have the redone front piece artwork that was done for editions in later on, I think in the early to mid 1940s. So that is retained as well, along with the original text block and the, obviously the way you can easily tell that this is the original text is the copyright date and the fact that we have a lot more chapters and a page count that goes over 200 pages. And if that were not enough, my favorite thing about this is that it opens with an automat scene, because Chet Morton becomes obsessed with the automat that has just opened. So if you love the idea of automats, or you're a fan of automats, or you love stories of the 20s and 30s and the pulp era, this wonderfully starts with an entire chapter in sequence inside of an automat. So I just always find that wonderfully endearing. Every time I come back to this, it's the fun that happens when Chet Morton gets let loose inside of an automat with some spare change. That, of course, does not happen in the revised text being written in 1967. But this is my edition of the original text, and it's in rather good shape. But you will notice when you get these later printings of the original text that the actual I guess the plates that they used had gotten so worn out from being all the reprints that were made. So as I'm reading through this, there are many instances where it's like when you have a worn out typewriter and some of the text is a little worn, or some of the letters or like some of the spaces are a little bit filled in, or they're sort of cut off a little bit. It's still perfectly readable, but you will notice that obviously in these sort of last couple reprints of original text, the actual printing plates must have been really worn down, and I've seen some examples where you have just entire pages filled with stuff like that, or it's a little off kilter or something. And again, it seems to be something that is because they had reprinted these books so many times and then just stopped. And then I have my flashlight cover edition of the revised text with the Rudy Nappy artwork. This, of course, has the unified design with the blue spine, and then the unified rear that's the same on all the flashlight editions. These are, all obviously sturdy. I've had this for years, ever since I was a kid, so it does have a little bit of wear on the spine. But this is also an earlier printing, and as I've mentioned in other videos, the earlier you get one of these in terms of the manufacturer and printing date, the stronger and sturdier and better made it is. This is a 1998 printing. So basically, if you have one it's really the ones before like 2005, but especially late 90s, early 2000s. That's when they were still making these well, and then 2005 onwards, it seems like they got. I hate to say sloppy, but you can tell they just don't feel as sturdy. They feel a little bit slimmer. They're not as solid in the hand. The binding isn't as good, and they put more ads in the back. You can tell it feels a little bit cheaper. So if you're trying to find flashlight editions, I think it's better to look for the slightly older copies in terms of the print date. But this, of course, does also have the opening blurb, all the revised text do, telling you about the plot. We have the new front artwork from when the boys are stuck inside of a subway tunnel and the train starts coming for them, because, of course, they find themselves continually in danger. And we also have the different text block that is unique to the revised text. But being the revised text, it also means we have the pieces of artwork scattered throughout. So this is from the opening, where, of course, the boys have to break in a sanctioned burglary. And it's not easy. They can't just go through the door. They have to climb in through the roof, through an open window, and go that way and almost break their neck as they see the actual other thieves starting to pull up, which starts the ticking clock, which is, again, why the opening of this and the revised text is so wonderfully done. Now, even though this was 1967, it's kind of funny when you look at some of the other illustrations that, some of the articles of clothing are still kind of dated in a way, so they're the boys are there and in interesting plaid jackets. Here's a nice 2-page spread that I've always really liked, where the boys see the suspect they're trailing duck into the Bayport train station, and this sets up when they have to follow him to New York. This is the added scene I really love where Frank goes in disguise to a prisoner in jail, one of the members of the gang, and tries to identify himself as a new gang member and basically pump him for information. So that's a fun scene, and of course it's nice getting a visual of the interesting disguise he uses. Here's a shot of the pilot after he parachuted out of the crashing plane, being cut down from the trees, so the boys landed safely and the poor pilot is stuck in the trees. So those are my thoughts on the 2 text editions of Book 10 in the original Hardy Boys canon book series, What Happened at Midnight, the original Leslie McFarlane 1931 text, and the revised text in 1967 by Tom Mulvey. This is, again, a great example of what the revisions could do when they kept the same story and tried to inject a sort of subplot to increase the pace of the action while also cutting down the page count. Again, it's dropping from about 210 pages in the original to around 170 in the revised text. So it is pretty significant, and in spite of keeping a lot of the same passages almost verbatim from the original, the number one thing to go is the sense of shades of gray and humor and world building and character building and all the fun aspects of the original text. So it's very informative to read them back to back. But if you do that, you'll definitely come away with the thought that the original text is the more fulfilling experience. Although the revised text does have nice bits of action. So I will continue this series and hopefully have a video soon for Book 11, While the Clock Ticked, and its 2 different text editions. As always, I hope my babblings about the Classic Hardy Boys series and just book collecting in general have been at least somewhat fun and informative. And as always, keep reading print books, keep supporting local independent bookstores wherever possible, and thank you ever so much for watching.